I think the passion for this area started with the landscape. I mean, it's a very beautiful place to live. We like that we're in the mountains. We like that we're remote. We like that it's a little hard to get here. Some people, come here just because there happens to be a job or something going on, but most are here because they really want to be and because they've made an effort.
Doukhobors are a religious sect that broke off from the Russian Orthodox Church. They're part of really a movement that came out of the Reformation when people were disillusioned with the Catholic Church and, in this case, the Russian Orthodox Church, and they were looking for religious faith that was more meaningful to them. And so they started to reject things like military service and swearing oaths to the state. They believe that the Spirit of God resides in every person and every living thing. So it's this very simplified, personalized kind of religious faith. And that got them into very big trouble in Russia when there was a deep connection between church and state and compulsory military service for the Tsar. There had been many, many years of strife and struggle with the Tsarist state in Russia. 1895, they sort of took a next step and they created this moment in time that's referred to as the burning of the arms. They collected all of their weapons and burned them in this symbolic moment. And essentially that made the Tsar very unhappy and they were exiled. Canada decided to welcome these refugees, essentially these exiles, to come and take up land in Saskatchewan and live how they wanted to live and guarantee that they would have freedom from not having to engage in military service and swear oaths of allegiance. So they came to Saskatchewan and they really make a life there. They spend about 7 years there. Very difficult work, breaking the land, working together with very few plows and farm equipment. And so at that point, their leader, Peter Verrigan, says, okay, we're going to be exiled again, essentially. And he came to the Kootenay region and he saw this area here at the confluence of the Kootenay and Columbia River. And he started to buy up land, ends up buying about 14,000 acres of land. And in 1908, about half of that Doukhobor community from Saskatchewan moves to the West Kootenays. And that's sort of how they end up here. There's sort of a golden age in this area of the kind of communal Doukhobor lifestyle. And the Doukhobor community was really here to prosper. In Doukhobor traditional lifestyle, everybody worked, from the most smallest child to the most elderly person. There was a division of labor and a gendered lines, for sure, with men doing a lot of work outside the community. So on projects like the Brilliant Suspension Bridge, and any wages that they made came back to the community. In this area that had only previously been home to Indigenous peoples, transportation is this huge problem.
Prior to the construction of the Brilliant Suspension Bridge, the Doukhobor community was centered around what we now call Udashenya. It was the completion of that bridge that allowed them to start settlement in earnest in what's now Brilliant, and what became the industrial headquarters in BC of the Doukhobor enterprise. Because Brilliant was adjacent to the railway, they were able to build things like the Kootenay Columbia Preserving Works, the jam factory, the orchards and the communal homes, and all of the other industry that went on at Brilliant for the Doukhobors.
So where the Brilliant Bridge is now, that was traditionally a ferry that was operated by a horse and pulley system that would move people and freight across that span of the river. And then over time, Peter Berrigan really became convinced that they needed a bridge there. They had been developing what would become highways. They knew ferries were inefficient and a bridge was sort of the way to go.
The government provided a subsidy to fund the construction, but it was mostly or entirely Doukhobor labor that put it together.
In the end, the bridge cost $60,000. The Doukhobor community put up 2/3 of that money. Now, the bridge itself was built by a crew of 40 Doukhobor men who worked for free, essentially, in Doukhobor tradition.
Opened in 1913. There's still a date stone on it. I think it says DS 1913, which stands for Doukhobor Society 1913. And then there was another very famous sign on it that prohibited crossing the bridge with tobacco or firearms. The bridge was decommissioned in the 60s. It was a highway bridge until it was replaced by the present Brilliant Bridge.
It was not functioning at the level that it needed to be. It's only 14 feet wide.
The plan initially was that they would demolish it, and I'm not exactly sure why that didn't happen. Probably because, just didn't want to spend the money on having to do that if it wasn't necessary.
You were unable to access it for a while, and it sort of falls into disarray. And then in the 90s, there's this really energized group of people say, this is a really important structure and we should preserve it. And so they really worked hard to gather money from multiple grant sources, caught the attention of the national body of heritage sites. I think that this bridge is a symbol of that communal effort. It's still there as this testament to connecting communities. People look back to their ancestors and say, look at what they did, and it's still here. When you think about that commitment of this community giving 2/3 of the cost of essentially a provincial mode of transportation, that's astounding. Unless you had a private donor or something that really was community minded, that's hard to find. People had this real understanding that you were going to need to connect Nelson and Trail in some kind of reasonable fashion, but these are hard things to do.
The time that it was built, there weren't a lot of cars on the road. So early traffic on that bridge probably would have been, horse and buggy, horse and wagons primarily. Prior to that, you could not get across the Kootenay River. There was a rail bridge, but other than that, you couldn't get across.
Construction of that bridge made that journey between Trail to Nelson so much more reasonable and manageable for everyone.
In the 30s, one interesting thing about it is that when the Coralin Dam was built, the water level rose in the river, and so the bridge had to be raised up as well. It does make sense. I mean, otherwise the water would have been on the deck of the bridge, so they had to raise it up. Late 70s, early 80s, the bridge was cut into sections, and the pieces were moved to the Slocan Valley to serve as one-lane bridges there at Valakan, Slocan Park, and Passmore. The Valakan Bridge has since been replaced, but the Passmore and Slocan Park bridges are still there, and they are still the legacy of the Taghum Bridge of more than, well, going on almost 110 years ago. Nelson particularly is an interesting city in that it was this little metropolis that grew up in the wilderness, essentially. Having a bridge cross Kootenay Lake was a dream of this area dating back to, well, I mean, ever since people started settling here. People started to lobby the government to build a bridge across Kootenay Lake, and I think it was promised to varying degrees at various times, but it took until 1957 for the Orange Bridge to be built.
Talking about it now, it's one of the more major projects, and all I took it on is a job. That was the big crux of the thing. Here was work that I knew I was well qualified for. At that time I had 9 years experience. They hadn't built anything concrete at the time I went there, so I was really there from day one. The best place to cross, the handiest place would have been at the end of the airport runway, the end of Baker Street in Nelson. They would go across. They analyzed that, and it was boggy ground is about the best way of putting it. It was determined that it would be very difficult. All of the piers would have had to been put on pilings and not to be stabilized and that. And the North Shore was quite solid. Actually, it was a better approach for a bridge there than the actual one that was built here. But that was abandoned and couldn't find any decent place to put this bridge. They picked one where it was built as being the best one available. First thing in building the bridge is they had to move some houses out of the way. Didn't watch it, but I knew it was happening, as moving a real nice big house that was owned by the government agent here in Nelson. The other ones they just tore down, but this house was so nice that they decided to move it out of the way, and it's still down close to the bridge. They had a policy. Every week, 2 guys would get fired, laid off. But the very next day, 2 guys would be hired. They didn't say they were firing them because they didn't like them or they were no good. They knew that 2 guys would be going every week, and 2 guys from the union office would be hired. It was a smart move kind of thing, and the union had to accept it. It was kind of a miserable thing, so it kept everybody on their toes. You didn't want to cross up or get into an argument with them or be lazy or anything else, but that was the deal. So I got laid off. The bridge was built, and laid off because the erection of the steel was a totally different contractor. It was Bickerton Bridge, I can still remember that. And they had to have a surveyor, and things weren't all that busy and whatnot. I only had, I had a couple of assistants working for me, and we were doing surveys, legal surveys and engineering surveys in the area. But the Bickerton Bridge guy decided, I was available and do it, so I was hired by them to give them the elevations and that they needed for erecting the steel. And one of the more interesting things was climbing up on these things and then being up 20, 30 feet off the ground all the time. And, I fondly remember it was a little bit of a stress to go up 40 feet of a ladder and whatnot, but then no matter what the weather was like, you had to go up there and climb up this ladder in snowy and blizzardy weather and whatnot. I could fond memories of it being such miserable weather. I wondered if you'd like to quit and go somewhere else. Still maintain I was the first guy from the area other than the iron workers to go across that bridge. I walked a little 20-foot beam, 20 feet long, 8 inches wide, walked across that in street shoes, leather-soled shoes, and they're slippery on steel. And hair must have been standing straight up.
I think whether people realize it or not, that bridge, it also changed Nelson in some ways in that even before there was a ferry that served that crossing, if you wanted to live on the North Shore, build a house there, and there were some houses, you would have to barge the materials across. To get to town, you'd have to take a rowboat. So it wasn't really super conducive, unless, mind you, you could probably have your provisions and things and not having to come into town all that often, even though you could see it right across the water. But once the bridge opened in 1957, then you started to see some institutions starting. The A&W or the Dairy Queen, those were things that were directly in response to car culture that was caused by the completion of the bridge. You started to see new subdivisions, new homes being built across the water, and people more freely going back and forth between the two sides of the lake. You could easily live on the North Shore and work in town. The North Shore and essentially became part of the town, whereas before there was definitely a remove or a divide there.
That bridge was painted aluminum. That was the popular thing. All the bridges were painted aluminum.
And then in 1969-70, it was painted orange. The color of the bridge has something to do with people's fondness for the bridge. There's no doubt about it. In the early 2000s, the Ministry of Transportation came to Nelson City Council and said, well, we're going to paint the bridge. Do you have any feelings about what color it should be? And City Council said, absolutely, it should stay orange. The mayor at the time was quoted as saying it would be something of a disaster if it was any other color. I wish I knew who was credited with coining the Big Orange Bridge, or I wish I knew who came up with it. The phrase only appears for the first time in print in February of 2000 in a story written by Stephen Harris. And I asked Stephen if he was the one who coined it. He said that he'd heard it from Nelson Becker, who was the publisher of the Express. And I've also asked Nelson if he coined it, and he doesn't think so. He thinks he heard it from somebody else. But who actually came up with it, to this day I don't know. And I also don't know how long it might have been in use before it finally appeared in print. We have other towns around here that are, very attractive. They're also in the mountains, they're also on the water, they're very attractive, but they might not have the same kind of built heritage that Nelson does. Many people do appreciate it, I think. For other people, it may not be as consciously important, but I think it is something that contributes to the vibrancy of the community, whether we realize it or not.